Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Looks like there's just barely enough seats here. I was wondering if I was going to have to schedule a recap next week, but looks like we fit. Okay, so first of all, I want to welcome you as the organizer of the Christian Perspectives in Science Seminar Series. This is the first session of the fall semester, and the Provost's office has asked me to organize more talks on this topic. Now, this isn't the only topic for this semester. There will be a talk or two on climate change and a few other topics as well this semester. But this semester and this year, we're hoping to get more talks on this topic, and you all can help me at the end by helping me figure out which specific topics we want to go in more depth. My goal today is to lay out sort of the landscape on this topic, and I'll address a lot of issues, and there's a lot of really deep topics. I'll talk for about 1 minute or 2 minutes, so you can tell me, hey, that's a topic we really need to spend more time on, please. All right, so now for myself. My name is Loren Haarsma. I teach in the Physics and Astronomy department, and the topic for today is scientific and theological issues on human origins. Now, there's a book, my co-author is sitting back there somewhere, which we wrote, which was commissioned by the denominational publisher. And at the beginning of chapter 11, the first of 2 chapters in Human Origins, we start off by saying, if you skipped ahead to these chapters, please go back and read chapters 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9, because they sort of introduce. And so, for you, the audience here, if the idea of an old Earth and the Big Bang cosmology and biological evolution is something that you're really concerned about and you're wondering how can a Christian believe those things, then this isn't the right seminar for you, because there's a lot of background material I'm just going to skip right past. On the other hand, if you have read this book, or if that's all old news to you, if you think, God can use evolutionary processes for plants and animals, God can use the Big Bang, not a problem, then you're certainly welcome to be here. Just letting you know, this isn't the material I cover in chapters 2 through 9. This is jumping right ahead. All right, so then what are some of the theological issues regarding human origins? Well, here's where I'll sort of lay out the ground, and maybe we can add a few more to this, but God's action in human origins, what does it mean to be created in the image of God, the soul, selfishness and morality, original sin, human mortality, biblical hermeneutics, the atonement, suffering and death in nature in general, theodicy and original sin. If you've already read this book, chapters 11 and 12, about half of the talk today is going to be familiar to you. And then for the other half of the talk, I'm going to be kind of moving on beyond what we could actually fit in the book. And then there's the scientific issues. Hominid fossils, genetic similarities in animals, genetic diversity in the human population. And then, if you really want to tick everybody off, then you try and combine them too. And that's what we're here to think about. Because we are Reformed Christians, we want to think about what does Scripture tell us and what does God's world tell us. So, I'm going to take the scientific issues in the framework of various interpretations of what do people propose for Adam and Eve. And then after I lay those out, then we'll get into the theological issues. So, the traditional view, which most of the churches had for most of the last 2,000 years, is something like this. Adam and Eve, as recent ancestors of all human beings, lived about 8,000 years ago. And of course, a lot of theologians over the last 2,000 years have written sort of assuming this scenario. Now, we've been learning some things over the last few centuries, in particularly the last century. There's hominid fossils, and what you see pictured here is a tiny fraction of all the hominid fossils, and Ralph Stearley could tell us a lot more about them all. Over down here at point N we have modern humans, and over here at point A we have fossils that are dated about 6 or 7 million years ago. Australopithecus fossils, and those fossils look a lot like fossils in the lineage of chimpanzees at about that same time. And then there's a steady progression of more human features. Right about in the middle, there's Homo habilis, lived about 2,000 years ago, apparently used stone tools, had a brain which was about half of modern human size. 2 million. Thank you. 2 million. Homo habilis lived about 2 million years ago. Wow. Thank you. 2 million years ago. That shows you my brain is running ahead of where my mouth is. Okay. Apparently used stone tools, had a brain about half the size of modern humans, but about twice that of chimpanzees. And then there's the genetic similarities to animals, and the book by Francis Collins called The Language of God does a pretty good job of talking about that. Scientists can sort of lay out a tree of common ancestry looking at genetics. Here's an analogy I sometimes use. Suppose there was a big family reunion of 200 people, uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents, second cousins twice removed, and you took a little swab of genetic material from everyone in that party and then send them all off to a lab labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Scientists could reconstruct the family tree not knowing anything except the genes that they got. They could tell person 5 was a first cousin of person 12, and so forth. Well, you can do the same thing with at the species level and see how species are related by common ancestry. In fact, there's an increasing number of entire genomic sequences of a whole species worked out scientifically, and I expect in a couple of years it's going to be a high school biology project with a good computer for students to download the genomes of a lot of different species and then line them up by their similarities into a family tree. And guess what? When those high school biology exercises come out, the human genome is going to be one of the ones that's part of the assignment. So genetic similarities with animals. So here's another scenario that's been proposed which kind of fits all that data. Let's move Adam and Eve back to about 150,000 years ago, which is about the earliest really modern-looking human fossils in Africa. You go more than 150,000 years ago and the fossils start to look a little more archaic, a little less like modern humans. And let's suppose that Adam and Eve were then, and we're all the descendants from a pair of human beings. Now, that if God sort of used common ancestry with animals and evolutionary processes to produce that pair, then we could all be descended from them. That would fit the fossil record. That would fit the genetic record, but it would not fit a third piece of evidence, the genetic diversity in the human population. Now here's another analogy. If you start an island somewhere with no dogs and you just take a single pair of dogs, for any gene location, any one of you or any dog has 2 genes, so between one male and one female there could be 4 genes, 4 versions of a gene, and that's as much genetic diversity as you have with 2 dogs. So you wait 20 generations later, and you look at the genetic diversity of all the dogs on the all the dogs on the island, and how much diversity is there? Well, not very much, because they're all descended from just 2 dogs. But if you start the population of that island with 50 pairs of dogs, there's a lot more genetic diversity in the initial population, there's a lot more genetic diversity in the final population. So, what do we do? What do we find when we look at the genetic diversity in the human population? What we find is data that's not really consistent with the idea that we all descended from a single pair of individuals 8,000 years ago, or even 150,000 years ago. When you fit the data to the best models that we can come up with, it looks like what's called a population bottleneck, which is if you have a large population and then over time it shrinks and then expands again like a bottleneck. That bottleneck would have been about 150,000 years ago, a few tens of thousands of individuals. Okay, there's some variability in that model, there's some error bars in that model, but it's not 2, it's tens of thousands. So this scenario here really does not match the genetic diversity we see in the human population, unless you propose something like God starting with 2 individuals and then in the first couple of generations just miraculously adding more genetic diversity. Then you could make this fit. But if you don't want to go that route, there are other options. Now here's a scenario for Adam and Eve, which was proposed centuries ago, long before modern science. The idea is that God used whatever means, could have been evolutionary processes, to produce all the males and females listed as God created males and females in Genesis 1. And then Genesis 2 talks about a specific pair of individuals selected as representatives of humanity about 8,000 years ago in the Near East. Now this was not a majority opinion among theologians as far as I can tell over the centuries, but it was certainly proposed over the centuries to answer questions like where did Cain get his wife, and how did all those cities get built in 1 or 2 generations after Adam and Eve. And so this scenario has been out there for quite a while. Now if you want to take scenarios 2 and 3, and by the way, this would fit all the scientific evidence. This scenario has no trouble with any of the scientific evidence we have. You can combine 2 and 3 into something like this. Adam and Eve are representatives of all of humanity in an ancient population about 150,000 years ago. They sinned. Their descendants interbred with the other human beings who were alive at that time, and we are all descended today from that small group, that Adam and Eve, or a small group, who sinned, plus others who were around at that time. And then there's the 5th scenario, which says, actually, a better interpretation of Genesis 1 is not to see Adam and Eve as historical individuals, but to see the Adam and Eve story as a telling of many historical events. There are many times from long ago up through modern times in which human beings have received a revelation from God, rebelled against God, and the essential theology taught in Genesis 2 and 3 is that we're all in this. And so Adam and Eve are seen as more symbolic figures. We'll come back to that later. So these are the 5 scenarios we're going to think about here. These first 4 scenarios are concordist scenarios in that they try and match the events of Genesis 2 and 3 in some way to various historical events. And the 5th scenario usually doesn't try to come up with a concordist interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3. All right, so let's get into theology. One thing to talk about in this topic is what do we mean by God working, God creating human beings? And if you're in the sciences, you like to think about how is God interacting with the natural world. Now, God works through scientifically understandable natural processes. We're all comfortable with that. Divine special revelation, which is a different category, God revealing himself. And of course, God can reveal himself in many ways to human beings. There can be a voice from above in a burning bush. There can also be the voice of conscience. There can be the voice of a prophet speaking. There are many ways that revelation can come. And all of these different scenarios would certainly incorporate these first 2, God working through scientifically understandable natural processes and divine special revelation. Now there's also other categories which people put out there. A spiritual transformation. You can imagine at some point in hominid history, God performing whatever you might think of as a spiritual transformation on certain individuals. And partly that gets into the issue of what you mean by the soul and the body and the soul. And I'll come to that. I'll say more about that later. And then there's the idea of a physical or biological transformation, sort of a miraculous transformation that is not really scientifically explainable. And that's certainly one type of divine action which you can put on the table in discussions about human origins. And all of this, some of the scenarios that I discussed incorporate 3 or 4 or both, but all of the scenarios certainly incorporate the first 2. Now we can go a lot more in depth on those topics another time, but let's move on. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? This is when I first started reading books on human origins about 20 years ago, started checking out books out of the theological libraries. One of the earliest things I learned is something that people who went to seminary knew long before I did, which is